There is a place on the map of Europe that is often referred to as one of Russia's strongest trump cards. A place that is meant to deter NATO, tie up its forces, and change the balance in the region. But the more it is talked about as a fortress, the less one essential question is asked. Would it really work exactly as many people think in a real conflict? The problem lies in the gap between imagination and reality, and that can decide much bigger things than just one region. Kaliningrad is often called a major Russian military base surrounded by NATO. Missiles, fleet, air defense, pressure on Poland, Lithuania, and the entire Baltic region. Some see it as Russian strength, others as a threat to address, but the situation isn't black and white. Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave surrounded by NATO, is logistically vulnerable and would have few options in a crisis. In this video, we'll look at both sides of this equation. Why does Kaliningrad seem like a strategic advantage, and why could it also be one of Russia's biggest weaknesses? Only in the end will it be clear if it's a trump card or an inescapable trap. You're watching Za Hranicami. Let's begin. The fortress on the map. At first glance, Kaliningrad looks like exactly the kind of place that's meant to deter an enemy before they even start thinking about conflict. A small Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea coast, but packed with military equipment, radar systems, and missiles that can reach far beyond its borders. In strategic analyses, it often appears as a point from which Russia can exert pressure on the entire Baltics, northern Poland, and key NATO routes in the region. And that's exactly why it's referred to as a fortress. When you look at the map, it makes sense. Kaliningrad lies between Poland and Lithuania, right on the Baltic Sea. Russia can monitor ships, aircraft, and troop movements from this area, and at the same time, it can deploy systems there that are meant to complicate any NATO military operation. Anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, ballistic systems capable of carrying nuclear warheads. On paper, this is a textbook example. A2AD zone, an area where enemy movement is heavily restricted. The consequence is clear. In the event of a crisis, NATO would have to take Kaliningrad into account immediately, not as a marginal issue, but as a factor that affects all defense planning in the region. Every troop movement, every reinforcement along the Baltics, every operation in the Baltic Sea would have to consider the question of what to do with this exclave. How do you neutralize its capabilities? And exactly at this point, it creates the impression that this is a Russian trump card that keeps the alliance in check. But this is where the story takes a turn. Because the more you look at Kaliningrad as a fortress, the less you ask what all has to work for it to really be won. And what happens the moment the conflict doesn't just move a step forward, but jumps several levels higher? And that's the point where a map advantage can turn into a strategic problem. What does Rusko actually have there? When you stop speaking in metaphors and look at Kaliningrad as a military area, something important suddenly becomes clear. It's not about a massive army ready to launch an offensive, but about a concentrated package of capabilities with one main goal: to deter and slow down. That's both its strength and limitation. Its foundation is missile systems. Iskander-M ballistic missiles have been deployed in Kaliningrad for a long time. Their significance is not in the numbers, but in the timing. Short range, quick preparation, hard to predict. In practice, this means that in a crisis, Russia could strike military targets in Poland, Lithuania, or Latvia before a full-scale response could be launched. It's not a weapon to win a war, but to disrupt the enemy's momentum. That's its purpose. The second layer has Bastion anti-ship systems. They change the Baltic Sea from a free maneuver space to one where every move involves risk. Not because Russia controls the Baltic, but because it can raise the cost of every decision about it. Every ship, movement, and operation becomes a question of losses. In modern conflicts, the risk alone often acts as a deterrent. Above all of this stands air defense. The S-400 systems, along with medium and short-range systems, provide layered protection while also safeguarding the batteries and radars. This makes Kaliningrad's airspace very unpleasant. It doesn't mean it's impenetrable. It means that breaking through it would require time, resources, and attention. That's exactly what Russia wants to achieve in the first hours of a crisis. When you look at the Air Force, the picture becomes even clearer. In the Kaliningrad region, the main base is the Chkalovsk Air Base, from which fighter and attack aircraft intended for regional deployment operate. Open sources have long reported about Sukhoi 27 aircraft and the more modern Sukhoi 30 SM supplemented by Sukhoi 24 ME attack aircraft. Their task is not to conduct large-scale air campaigns, but to control the airspace, respond to NATO movements, and, in case of crisis, carry out rapid strikes on military targets in the region. There are no strategic bombers or large refueling capacities in Kaliningrad, which clearly indicates that this is defensive and regional aviation, not a tool for long-term offensives. And then there are the ground forces. This isn't a large group of tens of thousands of soldiers ready for invasion. Open Western and Russian sources mention a range of about 10 to 15,000 soldiers, including ground units, missile and air defense system operators, and Baltic Fleet personnel. The exact numbers aren't public and change, but that's not what's important. Kaliningrad isn't a manpower warehouse. It's an area where specialized units are concentrated to defend, control key systems, and apply pressure early in a crisis. This highlights a key point. Russia lacks the strength for a prolonged conflict, only for the initial days. To complicate the situation, distract NATO's attention, and increase the risk of escalation. And that's why the next question isn't about what's there, but about what it can actually do to the opponent. A bubble that delays. A 2AD sounds like a technical term, but in practice it's a very simple logic. It's not about beating the opponent, but slowing him, making him hesitate, and raising the cost of each step. That's precisely Kaliningrad's role in the broader strategy. The combination of missiles, air defense, radars, and naval systems creates an area that NATO cannot automatically enter. Every flight, every movement of ships, every attempt to reinforce through the Baltics has to take into account that it will be monitored, threatened, and potentially attacked. Not because Kaliningrad can close the whole region, but because it can weaken the certainty underlying the alliance's rapid response. In the air, it means one thing. NATO may have technological superiority, but in the first hours of a conflict, it wouldn't be able to act routinely. The air defense in Kaliningrad would force Allied air forces to spend time and resources suppressing it before any other operations could begin. Every minute you have to spend opening up the airspace is a minute you can't use elsewhere. And that's exactly the time Russia is after. At sea, it's similar. The Black Sea is narrow, easy to monitor, and very dangerous during a crisis. The anti-ship systems deployed in Kaliningrad, together with the units of the Black Sea Fleet, turn this area into a zone where NATO cannot afford to make a mistake. It doesn't mean that Russia controls the Baltic. It means that every operation would carry the risk of losses from day one. And even that is enough to slow down planning and complicate decision-making. The consequence is strategic, not tactical. Kaliningrad is not meant to win a battle. It's meant to disrupt the fluidity of NATO's response, to create chaos in planning, slow down movements, and force the alliance to deal with one problem before it can address the others. And that's exactly why this exclave is talked about as a problem that must be dealt with immediately if the situation escalates. But every bubble has one characteristic. It only works as long as the opponent tolerates it. And the moment they decide to burst it, it stops being an abstract concept from analytical studies and becomes a very concrete scenario. The exclave under pressure, Kaliningrad, has one characteristic that no missiles or range maps can change. It is an exclave. A territory cut off from Russia, surrounded by NATO and reliant on sea and air. Here, the fortress becomes a problem. In peacetime, it doesn't matter. Ships sail, planes fly, and supplies flow. In a crisis, the rules change immediately. The sea is no longer neutral, and airspace becomes the first battlefield. At that point, logistics shifts from strength to weakness. Kaliningrad has nowhere to retreat, no way to send reinforcements, and no way to quickly replace losses. Everything it has must work immediately, and if something fails, there is no easy replacement that fundamentally changes the equation. While NATO can move forces from multiple directions, Kaliningrad is enclosed in an area that is easily defined and monitored. Every port, every airport, every warehouse has clear coordinates. And in a modern conflict, that means everything important is also a potential target. This is where the idea of an impregnable fortress fails. A2 and D systems can complicate the situation on the outside, but they can't fix the problem within. They can't ensure long-term supply, unit rotation, or the restoration of damaged capacities. Kaliningrad is not a place where you can fight a long war. It's a place where you can create a crisis, not maintain one. And that has a serious consequence. The more Russia bases its regional strategy on Kaliningrad, the more it becomes a point it can't afford to lose. Not militarily, but politically. Because losing control over the exclave would not only mean a defeat on the map, but also the collapse of the deterrent effect. That's why, in the next step, the question isn't whether Kaliningrad could defend the region, but to what would happen the moment someone decided to solve this problem immediately and without delay. In the early days of the conflict, if tension escalated to open war, Kaliningrad would not be a secondary front. It would be one of the first things that would have to be dealt with. Not because anyone wants to occupy it, but because without neutralizing it, nothing else could be done safely. In the first hours, it wouldn't be about massive ground battles. It would be about systems, radars, air defense, command nodes, and ammunition depots. The goal wouldn't be territory, but capabilities. Every disabled battery, every silenced radar would immediately change the balance in the region. The longer these systems operated, the more cautiously and slowly it would have to act. That's why pressure to suppress them would come soon. In the air, that would mean only one thing: no routine flights, no automatic superiority. First, there would have to be opening up the airspace, suppressing air defenses, testing reactions. Every step would be accompanied by the risk of escalation, because Kaliningrad is not an anonymous base. It's a politically sensitive area where military decisions immediately turn into strategic signals. At sea, the pressure would be similar. The Black Sea would shift from a transit area to a zone where every move is assessed in real time. Even a minor collision or a limited intervention could trigger a chain of events that could no longer be easily stopped. It's exactly this fear of uncontrolled escalation that makes Kaliningrad so sensitive. From the Russian perspective, the problem would be even more acute. If Kaliningrad were to come under pressure and its systems started to fail, there would be no easy way to reverse the situation without further raising the stakes. Reinforcements can't be sent there quickly. Supplies can't be replenished without risk. Every further step would mean deciding between retreat and escalation. And that's exactly the dilemma that neither side wants, but which this exclave constantly creates. The first days wouldn't focus on winning, but on who can handle pressure and who must react quicker than they'd prefer. This brings us to why Russia can't afford to lose this area, despite it causing more long-term problems than benefits. Why can't Putin afford to lose it? Militarily, Kaliningrad is complex and vulnerable. However, from a political perspective, it is irreplaceable, and this is exactly where it becomes clear why Russia cannot afford to sacrifice it, even when it turns into a strategic burden. For Vladimir Putin, Kaliningrad is not just a collection of bases and systems. It proves Russia can be present where the West opposes its presence. It's a physical symbol showing Moscow can keep NATO on edge without crossing borders. In Russian strategy, symbolism often matters as much as military effectiveness. Kaliningrad ties up forces. It forces planning, shifting capacities, simulating scenarios. Even if nothing is happening, the alliance can't ignore it. And that means Russia is achieving one of its goals without a single shot being fired. It creates uncertainty and pressure. And it maintains the feeling that escalation is always just one step closer than anyone would wish. The loss of Kaliningrad would immediately break this effect. It would be more than a territorial defeat. It would undermine the deterrence supporting Russia's stance in the Baltics. It would suddenly become clear that strong militarization, A2AD systems, and political rhetoric can't protect an isolated enclave during a serious crisis. And that's a signal the Kremlin cannot afford to send, not just towards NATO, but also internally. That's why Kaliningrad is becoming a hostage of its own strategy. The more Russia presents it as a trump card, the higher the expectations that it will be able to defend it if necessary. As expectations rise, there's less room to maneuver during a crisis. To back down means to lose face. To escalate means to risk more than anyone would rationally accept. And it is at this point that Kaliningrad stops appearing as an advantage and starts to feel like a trap. A trap that makes you react quickly and harshly with no chance to return to normal. Conclusion: trump card or trap? At first glance, the answer seems temptingly simple. Kaliningrad as Russia's trump card. A strong, militarized enclave that keeps NATO on edge and forces it to consider the risk from the very first minute of a crisis. This image works well in political statements and media sound bites. But the deeper you dive into this logic, the more it becomes clear that reality is less comfortable. Kaliningrad strengthens Russia's negotiating position in the short term. It distracts, delays responses, and raises decision costs. It's a tool of pressure, not a tool of victory. The problem arises the moment that pressure turns into conflict. That's when a trump card backfires. A liability that needs to be defended, supplied, and politically justified in an environment where Russia has minimal room to maneuver. Kaliningrad can't retreat, lacks depth, and has no alternatives. If it works, it only works as long as the other side tolerates it as a threat, not as a target. Once it chooses to solve this problem, the X key's advantages become disadvantages. Clearly defined space, clearly known capacities, precisely set boundaries of escalation. And that's the point that makes Kaliningrad dangerous for everyone. Not because it would cause a war on its own, but it limits decision-making options. It pushes you to act fast and pick between bad options. In geopolitics, these situations often lead to the biggest mistakes. The real question isn't if Kaliningrad is strong or weak. The question is whether it's sustainable as a long-term tool of deterrence. Or if, over time, pressure builds to a point where escalation becomes unavoidable. That's why Kaliningrad is more than just a Russian exclave in the Baltic. It's a test of how far deterrence policy can go before it becomes a trap from which there is no safe return.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work by showing gratitude. To help the video reach more people, click on praise. Thank you.